Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of Bite Back, I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of Johnny's memoir, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. As I'm sure most of you know, in 1985, aged 15 and armed with his father's stolen credit card, Johnny ran away to Addis Ababa to offer his assistance in the devastating famine. Sadly, on arrival, he realised that there wasn't much demand for help from 15-year-old boys. Johnny's book is a rare political memoir from a man whose life outside of politics is as gripping as that in the corridors of power. And to hear more, Channel 4's Gary Gibbon is going to be speaking with Johnny. So without much ado, I'd like to welcome both Johnny and Gary, who are going to be speaking. Just before they start, I'd like to say that copies of the book are available through the Bite Back website tonight for £14.99. So do place your orders afterwards if you haven't got a copy yet.
Thank you, Suzanne, and a bargain at the price, I would say. But thank you and welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar. I just want to say a few thank yous myself before I hand over to Gary, who's going to be in charge for the remainder of the event. First of all, of course, thank you to the fantastic team at Bite Back Publishing. To James Stevens for putting his faith in me and in the book, to my amazing editor, Olivia Beattie, to Suzanne herself, and to Vicky Jessup and all the team who've done so much to publicise and market the book, and to Nam Kwan Cho for designing what I hope you will agree is a stunning cover. I want to say a particularly huge thank you to my dad and my late mum for their amazing forbearance and love. And if you've read the book already, you will really know how great that was. I also want to say a massive thanks to my husband, David, who, as I say in the dedication at the front of the book, has absolutely lit up my love with happiness. Thanks also to my sister and brothers and their partners and my nieces and nephews and godchildren and all my relatives for all their care and support. But a particular shout out to my nephew Barney, whose fantastic photographic skills are in evidence on the book jacket and in my social media post this morning. And if you're in need of photographic services, you could not do better than check out his Instagram feed at Barney Oates. Okay, that's the commercial break over. But thanks also to all my friends who've helped me along the way. They're really too numerous to name, but I really do particularly want to thank Ruth, who I've known since I first remember anything really, and two of my schoolmates, Nick and Sarah, who since those days have always been there for me whenever I've needed them, and to my best man Vijay, and to Davina and Darcy and Kira, who are real heroes for joining from Sydney, Australia, so early in the morning. I owe a debt of thanks that I'll never truly be able to repay to Father Charles Sherlock, who rescued me in Ethiopia and whose wisdom and kindness saved me and inspired me, and without whom my story might have had a very different ending. But thank you lastly, but by no means least of all, to all of you who've joined this virtual launch. I'm sorry we can't meet in person and offer you the traditional publisher's lukewarm white wine, but I'm so grateful for your support. There are 180 people on this call at the moment, which is just overwhelming, and not just from the UK, but from France and Germany, Zimbabwe, South Africa, the US and Australia. So thank you so much. I hope you'll enjoy the book, and I hope you'll agree that at its heart is a story of optimism and hope. That's all from me for the moment. Now I'm going to hand over to Gary Gibbon, Channel 4's brilliant political editor. Thanks so much, Gary, for agreeing to take part in this event, and over to you.
It's a pleasure. Very nice to see you, and although I can't see you, sort of see everybody else. Johnny, it is a very, very interesting book, and an enormously gripping read, and so unlike any other political memoir I've had to trawl through. I've had to read the early years of Norman Fowler, for goodness sake, amongst others. And the early years of politicians are things they're normally particularly evasive about. It's actually the epicenter of your book and your story. And yet you've been a public figure for a while, and I didn't know this story, and I wonder how many other people are watching this didn't know this story. As Suzanne said, we know it now because we've got the bones of the story, and anybody who's been lucky enough to read it has the detail as well. When did you first realize that actually this was a mega story, one you had to share more widely? When did the penny drop?
I don't think, to be honest, the penny did drop. The reason I wrote it, really, originally, the reason I wanted to write it was actually because I wanted to write a novel. And I thought I couldn't write a novel unless I sort of got this out of my system. And I also, just from a cathartic point of view, I thought that this is something I'd like to do. And when I started it, I didn't have a publisher. And I wrote probably about 25,000 words, mainly the chapters about Ethiopia. And then, of course, I got distracted by other things. Eventually, I realized that if I didn't get a publisher, I'd never finish it. And so I was very lucky with Bite Back, and they agreed to publish it, and they did give me a deadline, and that really did push me to do it. And I suppose, I mean, you know, I'd always wanted, if I was going to write a book, I can't stand those memoirs you read, which are all about kind of, you know, why everything I did was right and all the things that went wrong was somebody else's fault. I thought the only point of writing was really to try and do it as honestly as you can. So that's how it came about. But to be honest, when I got sent the sort of blurb to have a look at for the jacket cover, and I think it says something like a heart-stoppingly candid memoir, and I thought, ooh, maybe I've been too open. But no, I'm pleased I was, because that was the point of it.
But political memoirs are often about settling scores or just getting an advance. This one's got a mission to it as well, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've loved books all my life. Absolutely loved books. And one of the things I loved about them was they made me feel less alone. I sort of met people in books that made me think, oh, well, you know, maybe I'm not the only completely mixed up person in this world. And I guess a really important thing for me, and particularly, you know, for people who really do find themselves in trouble and suffering depression and struggling with life. Yeah, I do really want to use it as a platform to say, I know life can just seem really difficult, really hard, but things can get better, things can get easier, and hang in there. And really just hope to be able to say, you know, what Father Charles Sherlock actually said to me, which was, you know, you are far more precious than you will be prepared to realize right now. And that's a message I'd like to get out to anybody who's listening, who's finding life difficult at the moment.
There's quite a few moments in the book where a set of words, sometimes quite short, just connect with you and almost literally pull you back from the brink, because people may not know every single twist and turn of the story if they haven't read it. But when you're in Addis Ababa, you go to the top of the hotel. It's a very nerve-jangling moment to read. It must be similarly for you to relive it as you write it. And tell us a bit about how bleak things were.
Yeah, it was very hard. I mean, I was 15 years old and I'd run away from home. I'd stolen my dad's credit card, and I'd got to Ethiopia. I'd gone to the aid agencies to offer my help, and of course discovered that, you know, they had no need for somebody without skills, and etc. And of course, when you're 15, you don't realize that, you know, all your parents will want is to know that you're safe and okay, and they'll want you home. You kind of think you've blown everything, and you know, and I just didn't see a way back. And I mean, it was hard to write. You know, a lot of these things you kind of put to the back of your, you know, your minds. You try and deal with. And as I say in the book, it was actually when I went back to Ethiopia, actually when I was working for Nick Clegg, and I stayed on the weekend, and I stayed in the same hotel, and I sort of thought of it, well, it'd be quite nice nostalgia. And as I say in the book, I remember walking out onto the balcony and thinking the thoughts that I had thought as a 15-year-old. And it, you know, that scared the life out of me. And I thought I need to kind of explore this for my own sake, to understand what's in there. And I suppose that's why I started to write it down in the beginning.
And when we're jumping forward a bit now, but when you're back in Addis Ababa on the Nick Clegg trip, as you say, you stay on a bit later, a bit after the trip, and meet Father Charles again, the man who has been contacted by your father and who saves you, really. Who knows what could have happened if he hadn't knocked on the door and taken you away from ill. Tell us a bit about the initial meeting and then meeting again all those years later.
Well, I mean, the initial meeting was a knock on the door of the room in the hotel, and Charles Sherlock had found me because my parents had got in touch with him. My dad is an Anglican clergyman and was the rector of St. Bride's Church at the time, and so he'd sort of used the church network. And there was an Anglican mission in Ethiopia, but Charles, of course, didn't know where I was, nor did my parents. And he very courageously drove out to the airport. And this was the time of a brutal Marxist military regime in Ethiopia. And he demanded from the security and immigration staff that he could go through the immigration cards, because he knew you had to write on an immigration card, you know, where you were staying. And in fact, when I'd been given an immigration card on the plane, I mean, I'd never been outside of Europe, so I'd never seen this before. That was my first misgiving, because it said on it, "Where are you staying?" And I thought, you know, I haven't got an idea. But anyway, Charles, you know, took on those sort of security officials, and they, as it turned out, were reasonably happy. And he went through them and he found the card, and he came to the hotel. I think the first time he came, I wasn't there, I must have been out, but when he came back, he came at the absolutely critical moment. So that was amazing. He knocked on the door, I opened it, thinking it would be room service, or, you know, they wanted to clean the room or something, and to tell them to go away, and it was him. And I tried to close the door once he said my name, so I thought, well, that's someone come to sort of, you know, take me back to face whatever consequences I have to. But he very firmly but very kindly said, look, just give me a chance to talk to you for, you know, 5-10 minutes, and then, you know, if you want, I'll go away, but give me that chance. And I did. And as you say, that conversation really was critical in saving me. The next time, actually, I had seen him in the UK afterwards, a year or two afterwards, and we had kept in contact, but we'd lost contact after a few years. You know, my fault for being a not very good correspondent. But so when I was going back to Ethiopia, and I told my dad I was doing that, and he said, well, you should get in touch with Charles. Tell him, you know, you are going back. You have some skills. I'm not quite sure what they were, but anyway, but you have some skills. And my dad went to the kind of clerical director and found an email address. And Charles was then a clergyman in Scotland. And so I emailed and I said, I just wanted to say thank you again for what you did for me, and to tell you I'm going back to Ethiopia, and this time I'm going with the Deputy Prime Minister. And Charles emailed back and said, well, when are you going? And I told him, and he said, well, that's amazing, because I'm going to be in Addis Ababa at that time. I mean, he kept strong connections there. So yeah, we met up, and that was, yeah, it was strange. It was wonderful. And it was brilliant, because it got me back in touch with him, allowed me to really say thank you. And we've kept in touch since then. He
handled it just the right way, didn't he? He gave you enough space to feel that you had some control over the situation. He wasn't just manhandling you back to England or something like that. It feels like there's a very strong lesson there for people as they read that book. Yeah, I think he was exactly the right person, and I think he handled it in exactly the right way. He didn't come and tell me, you've been completely irresponsible, now you have to come back. I don't know what would have happened in those circumstances. He just set out things for me, explained to me how loved and cared for I was, and talked to me a bit about, he said, well, we all make mistakes, and this one may look like a particularly big one, but it's what you learn from things. And his tone and his manner was amazing. I mean, as I say, it sort of saved me and inspired me. And it was he who said to me, you're no real use. I mean, he didn't say that at that moment, but he said to me later, you're no real use here now, but go back to the UK, get some skills. And, the TV cameras will have forgotten about Africa in a few months' time. And I really took that to heart, and I've spent quite a lot of time since, amazing times in Zimbabwe and South Africa and other parts of Africa. Yes, because Africa becomes a part of your life. But just before I ask you about that, what are the kids like back at school when you come? Kids can be very cruel sometimes, and you've done something way out of the ordinary, and that doesn't always go down well. Well, what kind of reception do you get? And had you fantastically surprised them by this behavior?
Well, I found the reception very odd. I mean, I came back, I absolutely sort of said I don't want to go back to this school, and I wanted to go to sixth form college. I was actually a sort of year younger in a way than I should have been, because my mum was a teacher and they wanted her to go full time, so they sort of admitted me a bit earlier than normal. So I wasn't 16 yet, and the sixth form colleges wouldn't take people under 16, I think. And but I just was, I can't go back to that school, I then I developed shingles. I think it was stress related, so I couldn't go back for a while. But my dad and my mum persuaded me, and I had an amazing housemaster, a guy called Terry Rogers, who kept me from being expelled for a long time, I think, but who really showed a lot of care for me. And they together persuaded me to go down for a day, and meet up with some of my friends and talk to them a bit and see. And I went down that day thinking, well, there's no way I'm going to go back. I mean, I think I was treated a bit warily, this guy's a bit crazy, but, with lots of love, lots of care from people. And actually, I as I say in the book, I was still, even at the end of that day, thinking I'm not coming back here, and I bumped into this guy who was, who was in the year above me, and I thought was a bit of a cool guy, and I didn't really know that well, and I was quite wary of. And he said to me, "You coming back?" And he was the first person who I said, "No, I'm not." I was like honest with everybody else. I sort of said, "Oh well, maybe we'll see." And he said, "Well, why not? We want you back. People miss you." And it was such sort of kind sentiment, in a way unexpected, and So John Brown was responsible for, I think, me going back to school in many ways. Yeah, when I got back, I mean, there was the Fine Young Cannibals had a song at that time. I think it was released in '85, but it was called Johnny Come Home, and it was actually about somebody who'd run away from home. That was played to me a lot when I went into it as well. But no, people were amazingly kind, and yeah, amazing, really.
You have a more organized African adventure before you go off to before you go off to university. You go off and teach in Zimbabwe. Then you're back again in Africa, in South Africa, working for Chief Buthelezi. It burns within you, doesn't it? I mean, I do wonder, you're not there now or heading back and going to do another job out there.
Gary, if the planes would carry me there, I think that probably I've marked down South Africa as my first trip once we're allowed back in. I'd sort of taken very much to heart what Charles has said. I had this opportunity to go and teach in a rural secondary school in Zimbabwe, and this was 1988. I arrived at the school with 2 other English guys, no qualifications beyond A-levels, and we found ourselves at this school. We were shown around the primary school by the primary school headmaster, and we said to him after he'd shown us around, "That's really nice, but we understand we're teaching in the secondary school, and could you show us around that?" And at that point, he sort of pointed, and we followed his indication, and we could see bush to the horizon. And he said, "Well, it hasn't actually been built yet." And the next day, we were expected to enroll 130 students the first year of that secondary school. And I think the school headmaster of the primary school, who was quite a formidable figure, and the kind of local traditional leaders had just decided, well, we've been given legal authority to open this school. They won't send us the money to build it. We'll open it, and then they'll have to build it. So that was an amazing year. I made some fantastic friends, and what's amazing to me now, and one of the joys of social media, is that many of those students who I kept in touch with for quite a long time afterwards, through letters, etc. But now, I'm in touch with over Facebook and other things, and they've had a really tough time in Zimbabwe. But those, I was going to say kids, they're like 40-year-olds now, but those students I taught, amazing inspiration. Loads of them still doing lots to help support that school, help kids get into education despite the difficult state. So it was amazing. But while I was there, I went to South Africa because one of the kids I taught, hadn't seen his dad for years, wanted me to see him in South Africa. And I went there, and of course, I was very naive. Still, most of my life, I think I was very naive. But anyway, I went to South Africa. It was under a state of emergency. It was a very vast, I mean, it was the dying days, but it didn't, didn't really realize it then. And I had some terrible experiences there. I saw for the first time, I'd seen it on TV, but face to face, the sort of whites only signs and all that. And I kind of got out of there as quickly as I could. And when I crossed the border at Bike Bridge into Zimbabwe, I remember feeling such a sense of relief. But one of the great things is I'm a bit of a hoarder, and I still have the notebook that I had at that time that I'd written in. And one of the things I said was, I will never go back to this place until apartheid's ended. But the idea at that time, which was April 1988, that in 2 years' time, Nelson Mandela would release the ANC, all the liberation movements would be unbanned. I mean, if you'd said that, you would have been, they would have sought immediate medical attention for you. That seemed crazy. So I suppose one of the other messages of the book is things that can seem absolutely stuck in aspect forever aren't, and they can change, and they can change very rapidly, but they don't change just by accident. They change by lots of people working together, dedicated together, and making change.
And that, as you say, that is a theme there, and you're in the Eastern Bloc in 1989, as well as having seen apartheid, and as well as having seen laws about homosexuality change, or attitudes to homosexuality change in your lifetime phenomenally. But the thing that really changes in this book is you. So, one moment you're this reckless, agonized youth, and then you're in charge of a class, or working for Buthelezi, or we'll come to this in a moment, working in government, one of the most sober and responsible people I've ever bumped into. And you were this, when's the moment of change? Can you work it out? Can you sense, does it happen immediately when you get back, or near enough immediately? Or when do you become the person we know now, not the one who hops on a plane and leaves everyone jittering and terrified?
Well, I mean, I don't think you leave any of that completely behind. I don't think there's a moment. I mean, hopefully you grow up a bit, hopefully you learn a bit, and also you have responsibilities. The first responsibility I ever had was when I stood up in front of a class thinking, oh my God, how can I teach? But I thought, these students, their parents are sending them to school, and although schooling was supposed to be free, you had to pay for school uniform, you had to pay sort of, out-of-pocket expenses for books and stuff. And this was a massive thing. A lot of the parents would have been subsistence farmers, and, it was a big deal. And I was responsible for their education, which their parents were making massive sacrifices to give them. So, I had to grow up really quite rapidly. And I think being treated like an adult actually makes you grow up as well. And I was there, just, get on with it. You're in charge. So I think that had a big impact.
You're very brutal on yourself in this book about the recklessness, the unknowingness of rushing off to Africa and the rest of it. I was thinking it might not be a reference that works with your Australian viewers at the moment, but you've Sasha Swired yourself here, haven't you, really? Not many people are that brutal with them. I should explain, Sasha Swire is someone who's written a tell-all brutal portrayal of the Cameron gang that recently came out. But you've done it on yourself here. Yeah,
I mean, I haven't read Sasha Squire's book, and
no, I'm sure
I like to think that my reflections are a little less maybe gossipy.
I think they are. Can we come though to the world that she's writing about, and you're writing about very differently in the last chunk of this book, about coming into politics, and you're catapulted to enormous responsibility. With no real background. When you come into the coalition government, some of the people on the other side of this table have been thinking about being prime minister or chancellor since they were in nappies, and you're in front of them, having to hold your own with Nick Clegg. That there must have been an element of sort of awe and inner panic, even as you looked calm at the time, wasn't there, as you go into government?
Yeah, it was a huge thing, and it was off the back of, although we'd got the largest share of vote that had ever been recorded for the party, it was a lot less good than it had looked at one point, and we'd actually lost some seats. So psychologically, it wasn't a great position. Personally, my politics had been much more centre left than centre right. So a coalition with the Conservative Party wasn't sort of number one on my list of aspirations. But it was a time when you don't choose your time, and we were asked, so you're going to step up to the plate or not? And I think quite rightly Nick said, well we are. But yeah, it was very difficult, and we didn't have all that sort of background and links, and we didn't have any real cheerleaders sort of in the media, and there were some particularly in print, who we were a bit of a threat to, because for the first time there were people in government who literally owed no favours at all to anyone. And you may have seen they dealt with that pretty brutally, but you know, you can't complain too much about those things. That's the sort of sea that you're sailing on. But you know, you have to get on with it. And yes, it can be sort of seem a bit overwhelming at times, but we tried to focus on doing some of the right things. Undoubtedly, we made some big mistakes, but I also think we had some great achievements. And what I've tried to do in the book is to be honest and candid about the mistakes we've made, but also to champion, you know, some of our achievements, because no one else is going to do it. You know, everybody wants to talk about the coalition as some sort of disaster. Personally, looking back on it, it looks like a bit of a stable, sane time to me, where we got some sort of, you know, big changes through. And to me, there was a bit of a tie-up, you know, from my early life. I'd sort of, you know, I'd struggled with my sexuality. I'd been inspired by that famous Michael Burke film from Ethiopia. And I'd sort of got involved in campaigning on international development issues. And, you know, when we were in government, we passed the Equal Marriage Act that would not have happened without people like Lynn Featherstone and Nick Clegg. Mike Moore, you know, Lib Dem MP, he passed the International Development Act, which guaranteed that 0.7% of our wealth would be was spent helping the poorest people in the planet. And people like Norma Lamb led the way on you know, setting targets for mental health for the first time ever. So there was a lot of things that came together, a lot of things to be proud of, for sure. A lot of mistakes as well. And one of the reasons I really want one day to get back into government is to learn from those mistakes and to do it better next time. But I think given how few there were of us, given that we hadn't been in government since the war, we managed to implement 80% of our manifesto and do some pretty radical things. And I think that's a reasonable record to stand on.
Do you think realistically the next time, though, would have to be with a party of the centre left, if you were to be in that position to be able to form a coalition again?
Well, I mean, I don't want to start speculating about coalitions. It's a thing we always try to avoid doing. And I think,
and we always try and drag you into doing.
Yes, it's exactly what you always try to drag us into, Gary, normally, unfortunately, successfully. But no, I think you have to deal with the circumstances at the time. I mean, I've been quite clear. I would much prefer a centre-left government. That's my personal preferences. You know, but if you can make a government better, and if you can genuinely feel that you've got a role that you can play, then I think you probably expected that you should step up to the plate. You know, there's parties that can remain incredibly pure, you know, and never be accused of making a mistake by staying out of government. But that's not really the point of politics. It's to try and change things. So if you think you can actually change things for the better, then it's something I think you should do.
There's a moment at the beginning of the coalition when Nick Clegg's slightly taken aback by the fact that George Osborne and David Cameron are fussing over who's going to have Dorney Wood, one of the homes that goes with great offices and all the rest of it. And I think Nick Clegg turns to you and says, "Who are these people?" Is that right? Did you work that out? I mean, what does make them tick? And are they the same people now, or just with different names and clothes on, or have they changed, the Conservatives?
Well, I think it goes back a bit to what you said. I mean, we hadn't spent all our time thinking about what posts we wanted in government, let alone which, you know, grace and favour residences we wanted. And I like to think that we wouldn't have done. and George Osborne had apparently been thinking about where his 40th birthday was going to be. I mean, that just astonished Nick. I mean, Nick just, that sort of thing just wasn't of interest. I mean, he'd been sort of focusing on policy, and it seemed that others had been focusing on houses. I mean, look, it was a minor thing, and I you know, whatever.
No, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
I just wondered what you make of Conservatives at the end of it. You've been up close watching them in the room. Do you think they are their hearts beat where yours does, or are they a different strain of humanity, and have they now changed beyond recognition? I just want your take on the species.
Well, I'm not sure I'd call it a species, and there are lots of very different people from one another in the Conservative Party. It's been a very broad brush. There were lots of people who I worked with in government who I had huge respect for, and still do. And I think that some of the things, you know, that David Cameron was willing to do, particularly, for example, over his reaction to the Bloody Sunday report that came in very early in his premiership, where there were people who wanted him to hedge and give legalistic approaches, and he absolutely would not, you know, and he was really clear and very brave against some of, you know, the kind of elements of his party would want him to do others. So, you know, I'm not in the business of disparaging people for different parties, and I think one of the real dangers in politics at the moment is that we say, because somebody takes a different view from us, they are by definition a bad person. That's not to say there weren't some people in the government who I didn't think, well, you know, these are you know, quite odd people, and it would be no massive revelation to say that, you know, Dominic Cummings and the Liberal Democrats did not go well together, and there were some other characters like that. But there's, you know, there's a lot of Conservatives who I've got huge amounts of respect for, just as there are lots of Labour people. And I think we've got to avoid this thing where, you know, everything becomes personalised. Of course, it's true, the government's very different from the sort of type of Conservative government it was, or Conservative Party it was in 2010.
I don't know if you know John Zarafa, but I can see one question that's come in asking me to ask you a few more names of people you actually admired out of that Conservative gang that you worked with. Sorry, there's a mute button, rather like the American presidential on you guys. So I'm just trying to read the questions as they come in. Yeah, and give us a list.
Well, that's John trying to be problematic.
I thought it might be.
To me. Well, I mostly the people I had issues with was mainly over policy rather than personality. You know, I found the George Osborne and the Treasury very difficult because I didn't think they had much vision. I don't know how much that's George and how much that's sort of traditional Treasury type thing, but I wasn't hugely impressed by that, I'll be honest. And there were, you know, a few of the special advisors who thought they were in some sort of, you know, cheap remake of The Thick of It, who, you know, didn't impress me, and who I always thought the hubris would find them out, and you know, it did, and I think it is finding out Dominic Cummings now. What I think is quite sad is, particularly in the situation we are at the moment, you know, obviously we've got a difficult situation post Brexit, we've got to all deal with, and we've got on top of that the coronavirus. And I think actually the government would have had a lot of goodwill, in fact did have a lot of goodwill at the beginning of this crisis. Certainly I think for the first time since I hadn't been in government, thank God I'm not, you know, and they could have dealt with that and helped themselves, but helped the country by, you know, showing a real focus and sense of purpose and some humility. But instead, we've had a lot of hubris and the opposite of humility and lack of effectiveness. I think that's a shame, and I think it is to do with some of the characters in Number 10 who I think are quite casual about, you know, the impacts of their very fixed ideas about things.
And on that point, Julia's put in a question asking, do you think the 0.7 is at risk? One of what you were saying was the cherished achievements of that government.
Well, I think if there hadn't been an act of parliament passed to guarantee it in law, it really would be at risk. In fact, I think it would have gone. And one of the ironies during the coalition was that the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats had in their manifesto since the 1970s that we should meet this requirement. It was originally a requirement from the Pearson report, but it became this UN target of 0.7%. And we just said we should meet it. The Conservative manifesto of 2010 said we should legislate for it, and we should legislate for it in the first session of Parliament. And in the first session of Parliament, the Conservatives said, well, let's, there's a lot of legislation on the table. Let's just concentrate on getting to the target. And we won't legislate this year, but we can do so next year. And we were happy with that. After all, it wasn't in our manifesto. And then the next year, the same thing happened in the next year. And then finally, we were like, well, they clearly don't want to do this, either because David Cameron and George Osborne were terrified of their backbenchers by then and their reaction, or else because they'd actually decided they were going to ditch it. But either way, they wouldn't do it. In one of the few strokes of good luck we had, one of our MPs, Mike Moore, had a private member's bill, which was second in the ballot, which is important if you're going to get things through. And he put this down as a bill. And the Tories went nuts, which I found very funny, and I enjoyed greatly expressing my bewilderment at this, given that we were just helping them meet a manifesto commitment of theirs. But I mean, it was boxing them in, and but I'm so glad it did, because I think, otherwise they would have got rid of it, the current government. But perhaps not Cameron and Osborne, I'm not sure, although I suspect they would have done.
If you'd known at the beginning of the coalition what the voters were going to do to you at the end of it, you wouldn't have gone into it, would you? You wouldn't have brought the party with you.
Well, the party probably wouldn't have agreed to it. I mean, it's difficult. We always knew we were going to suffer. We, of course, thought that, over a 5-year period, we'd be able to recover. But one of the sobering things for me was after the 2015 election and the catastrophe of that for the Lib Dems. I saw a friend of mine and his wife, who's Italian, and she said, "Oh, Johnny, don't worry. We know all about coalitions in Italy. Of course, this is what happens. You're the junior partner. You go in. It's all great, and then you get blamed for everything, and you get stuffed. And then at some point, some years later, you'll probably rebuild yourself. But if you go back into coalition again, the same will happen to you." Which seemed a bit fatalistically depressing, but perhaps right. You can't, but in one sense, that question is not one that can ever be put, because you don't know what will happen at the end.
You don't know what will happen, but I just wonder whether it'll mean the party is even more reluctant next time round to go near any kind of project like this.
Well, I think they'll be cautious about what we do, but remember that I was told almost daily by journalists, I'm sure not by you, Gary, but almost daily by journalists in the lead up to the coalition, that there was absolutely no way the Liberal Democrats could ever get agreed through what we had, you may recall, this cumbersome thing called the triple lock process, which was a very cumbersome process by which our party had to approve things. And I said, no, you'll see that the party is very pragmatic and will do the right thing. Now, I have to say that sometimes that was more in hope than expectation I said it, but the party did. It'll make its decisions, obviously, in its light of the experience of it's had. But, we'll see.
before I just want to dart back for a moment, because there's been quite a few questions from people listening on South Africa, and people want to know just how worried you are about the situation in South Africa and whether it is repairable and how. What's your take?
I think South Africa, faces a lot of challenges, but I think the one thing to really remember and hold on to is, in 1988, it seemed impossible that South Africa could escape from this, white racial tyranny without some appalling kind of bloodbath. And actually, they found a way through. Certainly, when I was living in South Africa, I mean, I found it was like living on a roller coaster. Sometimes you were absolutely at the top, utterly inspired and amazed by what had been achieved, and other times, it was very depressing. I think one of the issues that South Africa has is, there was the education system under the apartheid regime was, I mean, it's hard to say of all the terrible things that happened under apartheid, but one of the most appalling things, and I remember reading this actually when I was about, well, it must have been after I'd come back from Zimbabwe, I guess, and I'd got interest in South Africa. But anybody who wants to understand that, you read the debate on the Bantu Education Act in the South African Parliament, where the South African minister is basically saying we're going to design an education system not to educate people, but to restrict their level of education. That's a terrible legacy for South Africa. Because of course there were no resources put into schools for non-white kids, and it is a big problem. It's also, South Africa faces a problem that Zimbabwe has as well, is that liberation movements and members of liberation movements, many of whom have sacrificed quite a lot to achieve independence or freedom, but they can quite quickly regard any opposition to them as illegitimate. And quite quickly, I mean, often it's actually the next generation after, but they claim that liberation mantle, many of them not necessarily having been involved, and use it to stifle dissent and to enrich themselves. And now that's obviously happened in Zimbabwe. It's obviously happened under Jacob Zuma in South Africa. I think Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, is doing his best to try and deal with it, but it's a very difficult situation. But my hope comes from, these amazing people who have achieved something that seemed unachievable, 30 years ago.
A couple of people, and I'm not sure they're entirely disinterested, have asked me to ask you who amongst the Lib Dem ministers in the coalition performed best. I mean, a bit like you, a lot of people have no background that prepared them. Some of them had a background in senior local figures in local politics and the rest of it, but most of them didn't have a background that prepared them for it. Who amazed you?
Well, I think, and I'll declare an interest, first of all, as I was his best man, but I think what Ed Davey did at the Energy and Climate Change Department was amazing. I mean, he fought a lot of battles against George Osborne in particular, who regarded, wind power as ridiculous, etc., was forever trying to block things. And Ed had the strategic mind and the steel in his backbone to work out what were the things that he had power over as Secretary of State that George wanted, and be really quite ruthless about pursuing them. As a result, we are generating huge amounts of renewable energy now that wouldn't be happening if it hadn't been for Ed. And the prices of all these things have come down massively, and apparently our Prime Minister now thinks it's all a wonderful idea, which is great. So Ed was a good example. Another person I'd really pick out was Lynn Featherstone, who was, she was a junior minister in the Home Office. But she went in and she—
with a rather difficult boss, it could be argued.
Yes. But she decided, I can get dragged into a whole lot of detail about everything. I can sit around complaining about, you know, I don't have enough power. Well, I can really think about what do I want to do. And Lynn decided, well, what I want to do is, you know, deliver equal marriage in this country. And she did it. And, you know, it was an amazing achievement. And she absolutely showed you don't have to be a Secretary of State to deliver real and lasting change.
And her Secretary of State was Theresa May, the Home Secretary, and they managed to build a relationship. And that whole coalition had some relationships that didn't work at all, but it had quite a few that did. And then we move into this more brutal, polarized politics, not just here but elsewhere. What's going on there? Is it a moment in the world or an era? Obviously, we're on the eve of an American presidential that might begin to give us an answer, but who knows? What's your feeling about that?
Well, I mean, I think the truth is that the political system post the financial collapse has stopped working for people. I think it maybe probably had somewhat earlier, and but you know all the parties had got certain things that they just, you know, they could get through. If you were Labour or Conservative, they didn't necessarily have to listen too much. We were a much smaller party, but so lots of voters were taken for granted, and I think people have felt that, whether it's you know, in the post-industrial parts of the UK or of the United States, and perhaps it resulted in Brexit here, and perhaps it resulted in, you know, the real shake-up of the political system, which gave rise to Trump. Because I think, you know, when somebody was saying to me the other day, you know, I'm just amazed, even now when it looks like Biden will win, by the number of people who actually say they'll still vote for Trump. But I think that's people less expressing a desire for Trump. I mean, obviously he has his fanatic supporters, but a lot of people, you know, expressing a desire not to go back to the old politics that didn't listen, and you know, liberal with a sort of very little L, and you know, just told people what they should think. And I think all of us, and that absolutely totally goes for the Lib Dems, and it goes for other parties as well, but we have to speak for ourselves. You know, I've got to start realizing we've got two ears and one mouth, and we should try and use them a bit more in that proportion. I think Ed certainly for the Lib Dems, you know, has got that. He's understood the scale of the challenge.
There's a couple of, I think, slightly frivolous questions, but we're getting later in the evening. That's all right. They've probably got wine, even though you haven't provided it. Something about Spurs and could they help Africa? We'll come back to that, maybe, I don't know. When's volume 2 coming? One person asked. Why there's no index, so I can find out if I'm mentioned or not, someone else asks.
Well, let me
take any of those.
The last one is very strategic, of course, because it makes you have to read the whole book, whoever you are. And you probably, having made that comment, deserve to find when you get to the end that you're not in it. But I'm not sure who that was, so I hope that doesn't sound unkind. No, it doesn't have an index, because it's not, you know, it's not actually that sort of book. It's not a political recitation of what happened in the coalition. It's really a sort of journey through emotions and politics and geographies and things. So that's that. Spurs, yes, Spurs has a good link actually with Africa. In fact, Cape Town, where Parliament is based, used to have a team called Cape Town Spurs. Sadly, it's now called, I think, Ajax Cape Town, or it was when I lived there. Spurs actually does a lot of work, community work in Africa. For those who don't know, I'm a Spurs fan, by the way. So I think that's where that question came from. Was there a third question?
Volume 2 was the.
Oh, volume 2. Yeah. No, I think the next thing, if I'm going to write something, and I've enjoyed it, actually, really enjoyed it. I think I want to write that novel I've always intended to write. So volume 2 will probably have to wait a while.
Someone else has put in the question, actually, I think it was John Campton who has written his own very good book recently. Is it possible, there you were with the Conservatives trying to find the best in them in coalition and seek out areas where you could make progress together. So that's been part of what you've been about. Can you see this government redeeming itself in some way, in your eyes, and building up connections with the world and doing some of the things which you think it's doing the worst possible version of at the moment? You could have been in coalition with them under different circumstances. Could you see this bunch, from your eyes, turning it round and doing things that you value and think good?
Well, they could, of course. And you know, they've obviously got a big majority, and they've, you know, in Parliament, so they've got the ability to do stuff. I think I'd go back to what I said earlier, which is if they would actually show, instead of what I think has been a lot of hubris and frankly weakness and ineptitude, they showed a bit of strength of purpose, a little bit of humility. I think they could deliver a lot. I mean, I still think it's very possible that they can deliver a deal with the European Union, even at this late stage. I think that is possible if they play it right. So I don't, you know, write that off completely. I think if they try and bring people together, they have a chance of you know, being very successful. I don't see much evidence of that. And I think, you know, one of the things that I think is an absolute tragedy is, you know, a government putting forward legislation which is being debated, I think, as we speak now in the House of Lords, that, you know, specifically in their words, they say breaks international law. And, you know, I've, you know, one of my absolute passions is, you know, trying to do whatever I can to promote, you know, a better situation in Zimbabwe in however small a way I can. But one of the big problems there is the rule of law. And you can already see, you look at the Twitter streams of government ministers, etc., you know, they're already there with it. Well, Britain can do what it wants, sort of thing. Now, I think that at our best we can set an example, and I don't think that's a good one. I'd stop doing things like that, and I'd start focusing on, you know, listening to people and focusing on getting a job done.
I think we're near the end of our time. So can I just ask you one last one, which has actually come up, I wanted to ask you, but it's come up in some of the questions on the screen as well. And it's about the personal toll that politics in the modern age takes on you. Is it possible to maintain your sort of moral center? Is it possible not to be sort of completely ground down, to avoid mental health issues, you know, which you start the book with? Is it possible to get through the a high-level modern political job without other issues coming up, and just basically not having enough time to think or consider other people? Take us a bit through those strains, and if there are coping mechanisms or a way we can improve political life.
I think, I mean, a friend and former colleague in the coalition of mine, Polly Mackenzie, wrote something on this actually very recently about how the sort of macho culture makes it very difficult for people actually who want to have a sort of broader, you know, family background, particularly amongst the sort of special advisor cadre. And actually that whole culture does not produce good decision making, and is not good for the people involved themselves. So I think, you know, sort of thinking about that and thinking about maybe trying to bring in a cadre of advisors who don't have that sort of, you know, macho winner takes all thing, and who can operate in an environment where they can have, you know, family life and the things that balance you. Yeah, I was incredibly lucky. You know, I have an amazingly supportive partner. I tried to keep myself sort of active and fit, which helped by sort of mental health, but it's massive pressure. And, you know, I felt that on me, and I was a sort of advisor behind the scenes. I think for elected politicians in the, you know, front line all the time, you know, with being doorstepped by, you know, the tabloid press and people outside your home, and it's pretty tough. So I just have huge admiration for them. I had an easy job, I think, compared with them.
Thank you very much indeed for chatting about all the book and many aspects of it and other things as well, and answering other people's questions. It is a terrific book. It's a very good read, and I think you've got a novel in you as well. It's been great to talk to you, Johnny.